The disappearance of Dennis Martin is well known to those interested in the subject of missing people. It has been so widely covered that some may wonder why I would even bother making a video on it. I think that there are many misconceptions out there about this case. Inaccurate and incomplete information has grown to create myths about such things as feral humans or cannibals living in the Great Smoky Mountains. In this video, I want to delve into some of these claims often made about this case, and see whether or not they have any validity. Because of this, I think even people familiar with this case will find new information in this video that they had not heard before. Keep in mind, this case is multifaceted and complex, with many details that are all important to achieve a proper understanding of the mystery that surrounds this story. First, I think it would be useful to anyone unfamiliar with this story to get a brief overview of the geography and key areas that will be discussed. Within the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a location called Spence Field, which is situated right along the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. The Appalachian Trail runs straight through Spence Field, and Boat Mountain Trail follows the West Prong River north until it turns into the West Prong Trail. From here, it is a little over a mile to a location known as Big Hollow. An area called Rowan's Creek is roughly 3 miles northwest of Spence Field as the crow flies. All of these trails and areas are relevant to this story. Six-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother Douglas, father William or Bill, and grandfather Clyde arrived at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on Friday, June 13th of 1969. Their trip was part of a family tradition of sorts that occurred every year. They would typically meet other members of their extended family and hike to Spence Field. Dennis was a special needs child with an educational delay of about 6 months. He was smaller, at about 55 pounds, but was said to be adventurous and enjoyed camping with his family. He was not known to wander off. The first night of their arrival in the park, Clyde Martin would befriend another man by the name of Carter Martin and his 2 sons. These 3 Martins were completely unrelated to Dennis and his family, only coincidentally sharing their same last name. Clyde invited Carter and his sons to stay the night with them in the Russell Field shelter, along with Dennis, Douglas, and Bill. The next morning, both groups set out for Spence Field, where they were planning to set up camp. Later in the day, after arriving at their destination, the kids came up with a plan to hide in the tree line in order to jump out and scare all the adults. The 3 older children went together while telling Dennis to go the opposite direction, down a longer path. They were afraid that his bright red shirt would give away their position if they all went together. Once the boys were in position, they jumped out and successfully startled the adults. Once the excitement ended, the adults noticed that Dennis was nowhere to be seen. At this point, it was about 4 to 4:30 in the evening, and Dennis had been missing for about 3 to 5 minutes at most. Bill Martin immediately began searching for his son, walking down the Appalachian Trail and calling his name, likely expecting to see him pop out at any given moment. He didn't. Bill returned to Spence Field to alert everyone that he could not locate Dennis. At this point, Dennis's grandfather, Clyde, began an almost 9-mile hike to a ranger station located near Cades Cove. When he arrived, he alerted Park Ranger Larry Nielsen, who contacted his superiors about Dennis's disappearance. As more searchers were called in, Ranger Nielsen and the Martins began searching the trails in the area and interviewing hikers, but found nothing. A heavy rainstorm hit the area that night, causing flooding in certain areas of the park. The rain only made trails muddy and treacherous, as well as cover up scent that may have been picked up by search dogs. By June 15th, the largest search in the history of the National Park Service had begun. The details of the search efforts are extensive, and an entire video could be made of all those details alone. Here is a more abridged version. Spence Field became the search base camp, with a headquarters as well as a makeshift heliport. At its peak, records show up to 1,400 searchers. These included rangers, firefighters, policemen, and people from other walks of life. Many civilian volunteer searchers were brought in to assist, but most were inexperienced. This ended up only causing confusion that slowed search efforts. Search dogs arrived in order to attempt to track young Dennis, and a detachment of Green Berets were also called in to assist during this time. So many searchers had arrived that their tracks cluttered the area, possibly damaging vital clues. On June 17th, searchers discovered footprints on a trail near West Prong. It belonged to an Oxford shoe, the same type Dennis was wearing, and was the size expected of a 6-year-old. The footprints also indicated that the child was wearing only one shoe, leaving the other barefoot. By June 18th, the FBI had become involved in the search, with a man named Jim Reich becoming the agent monitoring the day-to-day operations. By June 29th, after 2 weeks of intense searching, officials asked themselves the question, where do we go from here? Some of the points discussed were the absence of evidence of kidnapping, the possibility of shutting down the search, and having 3 of the park's best rangers stay on for an extended duration, and Bill Martin's belief in psychics and whether or not psychic predictions should be pursued. A number of predictions are listed in the NPS report. Some of them were investigated, but with no results. Most of these predictions are very vague and offer little to go on. All major search operations ceased on this day, except for 3 of the park's top rangers who would conduct small searches until September. Over 13,000 man-hours and 200 flight hours were used in this search. Much was learned by the Park Service on how to conduct future searches. They found out there's definitely a saturation point when it comes to searchers, and that too many is more of a hindrance than a help. On July 21st, important information was released to the media regarding the experience of a man named Harold Key and his family. Mr. Key, a war veteran and highway engineer, was on a trip with his family in the Smoky Mountains the very same day Dennis disappeared. Key, his wife, daughter, and 2 sons were in an area called C Branch, near Rowan's Creek, hoping to catch a glimpse of a bear or a wild hog. According to articles, the group was walking in the forest when they heard a horrifying scream. As they continued moving forward, Mr. Key's sons said that they could see a bear. Mr. Key himself said it was a man hiding in some bushes. The official wording of one of these news articles reads as follows. My sons and I were walking up a creek bed on June 14th, looking for bears. We heard a terrible scream. We walked about 200 yards and my sons said they could see a bear. But it wasn't a bear. It was a man hiding in some bushes. He was definitely avoiding us. At the time, Mr. Key did not think much of this incident. It was only after hearing about the disappearance of Dennis Martin that the memory began to gnaw at him, and he came forward and met with the FBI and park officials, showing them the location of his sighting. The newspapers would go on to say that search officials expressed doubt that the man and the scream were related to Dennis due to the distance between Rowan's Creek and Spence Field, which for a person taking the known trails is about 7 miles. Dennis disappeared around 4:30 p.m. according to the official report on this case. Mr. Key, while unsure of the exact time of his encounter, says he saw the man sometime between 4 and 5 p.m. This did not leave much time for a man to make the journey from Spence Field to Rowan's Creek. However, both of these times could be considered rough estimates. Afterwards, this incident would essentially be ignored by news and search officials. But Bill Martin took a deep interest in the sighting, believing it to be evidence supporting the theory that Dennis was kidnapped. Mr. Martin was also angered because he only found out about the Key sighting after reading it in the paper, while the authorities had balked at informing him themselves. Mr. Martin would eventually speak with Mr. Key and discuss the sighting, but ultimately nothing would come of it, and Dennis Martin would never be found. Bill Martin had to endure what nobody on earth ever should. The many days he spent fruitlessly searching for his son likely took a mental toll that is incalculable. Parents of lost children tend to blame themselves, and Bill Martin was no exception. He tirelessly searched the forest for his child, but to no avail. He had to endure the media pestering him for interviews, and authorities who did not keep him readily updated on the search for his son. Mr. Martin always held the belief that Dennis was abducted, especially once he learned of Harold Key's sighting. He believed there was no way that Dennis could have disappeared in the short time that he had lost sight of him. Authorities, however, refused to entertain the idea that Dennis was abducted. Bill Martin would not give any more interviews regarding his son's disappearance for many more years. In 2012, David Paulides released his book, Missing 411, The Eastern United States. This book contains a lengthy portion regarding the disappearance of Dennis Martin. Perhaps the most well-known sections are from the interviews he did with Bill Martin and former ranger Dwight McCarter. Paulides states that he showed up at Mr. Martin's home in the summer of 2011, knocked on his door and requested to speak with him regarding the disappearance of his son. Mr. Martin eventually agreed to speak with Paulides. Some of the highlights of their conversation are these. Bill Martin stated that he and a National Park serviceman hiked from Spence Field to the area where Harold Key had his sighting in about 90 minutes, thus showing it was not out of the realm of possibility that a man could have carried young Dennis there. Martin also told Paulides that he met with Harold Key in person and discussed his sighting. Martin claimed that Mr. Key said the man he saw moving through the forest was carrying something over his shoulder, the insinuation being that this man might have been carrying Dennis. Mr. Martin did not know why this was not reported in the newspapers. He would go on to mention that Jim Reich, the FBI agent on scene during the search for Dennis, later killed himself, but he did not know if this had anything to do with Dennis's disappearance. Paulides also interviewed a man named Dwight McCarter. McCarter was a ranger that actively searched for Dennis Martin in 1969 and is a highly accomplished tracker. By 2011, he was retired and living near the Great Smoky Mountains. Paulides' interview with him provided new insights. McCarter agreed that a man could carry a small child from Spence Field to the location of the Key sighting, contrary to what authorities have asserted. When asked who he thought made the terrible scream, McCarter suggested it might have been Dennis. Paulides then points out that the description sounds like it was too loud to be a child, possibly suggesting that the scream was made by whoever the Keys had seen in the forest. Paulides asked about the Green Berets who showed up to assist in the search, and whether or not McCarter thought it was strange that they were searching while armed with weapons. McCarter apparently thought it a little strange, but that they were the military and they acted on their own. When asked why he thought the Keys' children saw a bear while Harold Key himself saw a man, McCarter responded that there were wild men in the park, that they are hairy and filthy and wear skins of dead animals. They live deep in the park and survive off the land with little to no contact with people. McCarter states that he was only aware of one wild man at the time, and he did not live near the location Dennis went missing. McCarter was very clear that the wild men were humans. These two interviews provided by Mr. Paulides have provided the foundation for much of the modern discourse that takes place regarding the Dennis Martin case. Bill Martin's claim that Mr. Key told him the mysterious figure in the forest was carrying something on his shoulder has often been a key element. Paulides states in his book that he was unable to interview Harold Key directly because he died in 2010. And I was able to confirm that Jim Reich did indeed die by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, but nobody can be sure what kind of demons the man was facing. Dwight McCarter's use of the term wild man is also worth discussing. While McCarter was very clear that he was only talking about human beings, it is worth noting that the term wild man is documented far back in history. Many newspapers in the early 1900s use wild man to describe what most people today would call a Bigfoot or Sasquatch, a cryptid that has really ingrained itself in this case for many years. When you consider the Key sighting, the Key children say that they thought they saw a bear. Harold Key thinks he saw a man. That can lead people to begin considering some amalgamation of the two. Then just add the fact that it was carrying something over its shoulder, and it doesn't take too much consideration before some people get to this. It has also been insinuated that the blood-curdling scream heard by Mr. Key came from this Sasquatch. You will find many people to this day claiming that Dennis Martin was abducted by this cryptid. This is one question I really want to delve into in this video. There are actually a number of claims about the case that I feel are worth checking out, and seem to permeate the internet. Among them are these. Nobody knows who called in the Green Berets. The Green Berets went into the woods fully armed because they were hunting something. The Green Berets were not in contact with the National Park Service and were acting on their own. The FBI hid vital information from Bill Martin. Harold Key and his family saw someone carrying something over their shoulder. A Sasquatch abducted Dennis Martin. A feral human or wild man abducted Dennis Martin. And Jim Reich killed himself because of this and other child disappearances he worked on. First, let's check the official National Parks report on the Dennis Martin search, which is readily available from the Park Service itself. The almost 100-page report contains plenty of detail on the day-to-day search efforts and lots of correspondence between officials. Immediately in the first few pages, we find that the Green Berets were called on June 16th, 2 days after Dennis went missing, when Ranger Myers contacted U.S. Forest Service District Ranger Duke Barr in Nantahala, who in turn contacted a man named Colonel Kinney, who requested and obtained permission from the 3rd Army headquarters at Fort Benning to transfer 40 special forces to the area. A whole 500 Green Berets were actually on maneuvers in the Nantahala Gorge area and were available to assist, but only a small fraction were sent over the course of the search. Had these men not been training so close by, it is likely there never would have been special forces on scene. Other information provided in the park's report seems to show that the NPS had at least some contact and collaboration with the Green Berets, as they were directly involved in the extraction plan if Dennis Martin was to be found. They would helicopter to the location and rappel down to retrieve the boy. This plan must have been worked out between the two groups. It's still entirely possible that for the most part the special forces acted alone, but this is not necessarily abnormal. The military has its own chain of command, and it's unlikely to integrate itself with civilians or even the Park Service. Regarding the claims about armed Green Berets, when I initially heard this, I always imagined a fully kitted soldier with an M16. However, looking through the photographs taken of military personnel at the time, there really is not a long gun to be found. It's possible that they were carrying sidearms, but this is hardly unusual. I carry a sidearm when I go hiking in areas that have bears or other dangerous wildlife, and the Smoky Mountains certainly has these animals. This is not definitive proof that the Green Berets were not carrying automatic weapons into the forest, because there are very few pictures readily available, but I did not see any evidence of it. This was not the first nor the last time Green Berets would be involved in the search for a missing person. Overall, I do not think it is strange that the Green Berets were on scene at this search. If anything, it seems like it was lucky that they were nearby on maneuvers. Bill Martin's displeasure with park officials and the FBI is apparent in the official NPS report, as he wrote a letter to them expressing his frustration. He was upset because he believed the FBI had some incorrect information, and he noticed small discrepancies in the official search report. Bill Martin was also unhappy that he was not present for the meeting between Harold Key, the FBI, and Park Service, when Mr. Key showed the authorities where he had his sighting at Rowan's Creek. In this letter, Mr. Martin makes reference to several phone calls he had with Mr. Key, and also the suspicious person Mr. Key saw, but says nothing about the alleged object the man was carrying over his shoulder. This is a point that Mr. Martin presumably would have been very adamant of addressing, yet it is nowhere in the letter. Why? The authorities undoubtedly did keep Mr. Martin in the dark with regards to information about the search for his son, but there may not have been any nefarious intentions behind it. A letter to the Chief of Park Operations states that Chief Ranger Lee Sneddon sat down with Mr. Martin and discussed his concerns, and that they were resolved to Mr. Martin's satisfaction. The letter goes on to state that it is not the FBI's purpose or practice during the course of an investigation to inform people outside the Bureau, not even those most vitally concerned, of the facts of the case as they develop them. One can only imagine how angering it would be to have the FBI withholding information about the disappearance of your son. But that does not mean it is altogether strange behavior for the FBI to do so, regardless of how much we think it is immoral. Oftentimes, this is done to preserve the integrity of a case and not leak vital information that could be used by potential suspects. However, as far as we are aware, the FBI has never officially stated that they believed Dennis had been abducted, or that there were any suspects. The letter also adds that Mr. Martin seems to have been needlessly concerned about the FBI getting the facts, which is the very expertise of the FBI. This statement is frankly ridiculous. Of course the father would be concerned about the FBI getting all of the relevant facts, especially when it seems the FBI are not taking important leads seriously. But is it possible the FBI had been taking these leads seriously all along, but never admitted to it? To this day, if you FOIA the Dennis Martin case file from the FBI, you will get over 100 completely blacked out pages. If they never had a suspect and never believed it was an abduction, what is there to hide over 50 years later? In recent years, Dwight McCarter has done numerous interviews and has openly discussed his involvement in the Dennis Martin case. He has also not shied away from giving his opinion on what he thinks happened to Dennis Martin. During an interview on the Terribly Vexed podcast in April of 2021, McCarter recalls an incident during the early days of the search. He says that he was going down the Boat Mountain Trail when he caught the scent of what he felt certain was a decomposing human body in the direction of West Prong. His fellow searchers agreed. When he alerted his superiors, he was told that the area had already been searched and that the smell was likely that of a dead crow. He was then commanded to search elsewhere. At the time, McCarter was a new ranger and did not have the confidence to challenge his superiors. To this day, however, McCarter is adamant that the smell was that of a human, not a crow, and he believes the Martin boy to be somewhere in the area of West Prong.
And I told Arthur and JR, I says, I smell something dead off in on West Prong. And they called the searchers or the people in charge up at Spence Field. They says, we're smelling something dead. Dwight's going down West Prong. Oh, he don't have to go down there. That's a dead crow. We found it the other day. I said, that ain't no damn dead crow. I says, you get back out of the mountains, and if you happen to find a dead crow, and go over and smell of it. It don't stink, you know. But a man stinks. Mm-hmm. I says, that boy is down West Prong. But I bet that boy is down on West Prong. There. Has to be.
Another key incident involving McCarter occurred in 1985, when an illegal ginseng harvester told McCarter that he had found skeletal remains in the vicinity of Big Hollow, not far from Spence Field. For those who don't know, the illegal harvesting of ginseng is a problem in the Smoky Mountains. The anonymous hunter said that the remains were that of a child, and that he made this discovery sometime in the early 70s, and thought it might be Dennis Martin. He was afraid of coming forward because of the illegal activities he was engaged in at the time, and his general distrust of the authorities. McCarter knew this individual and believed his story to be credible. A volunteer search team was put together and went out to Big Hollow in search of the remains. Nothing was found, but many years had already passed, and the ground at the time was reportedly covered in a thick layer of decayed foliage. This would make finding buried remains without an exact location near impossible. No further searches of the area have been conducted that I'm aware of. Regarding the wild man that McCarter has become so famous for speaking of, he states the man's real name was Arlie Phillips, and that he lived in Cataloochee. This area is far from Spence Field. McCarter and his fellow rangers would refer to him as the wild man of the Cataloochee. He describes the man as living in a secluded cabin in the woods and eating out of garbage cans, but being generally harmless. The few pictures that exist of the so-called wild man of the Cataloochee show him to be a fairly normal-looking individual, revealing that Dwight McCarter's wild man is not really as wild as some would have people believe. Arlie Phillips passed away in 2010, but the myth of feral humans or wild men in the Smokies continues to be perpetuated by people online to this day. It is clear after listening to Dwight McCarter speak that this was not how he ever expected or wanted his words to be construed.
Was he the only wild man that you knew of that for sure lived in the Smoky Mountains or in this area? Or could there have been other people back up in there?
Well, we were talking about the Martin boy on that branch, that one branch before you get to the exit of Cage Cove, Loop Road. He's sort of a wild man, according to the family that in Carthage, Tennessee, But the wild man got in a white van there. The Carthage people said when they drove up that they went past the white van. It's an old, dirty white van. That's an incentive to go get that book. I think Michael Bouchard, that's where I'm getting that. I think Michael interviewed the Carthage family. He had solved over 45 murder cases, or Michael had.
He's a detective, you said.
Yep.
Michael C. Bouchard has served as a police officer in Connecticut for 25 years. Today, he is also a true crime author who looks into many cold cases. In 2016, he published the book Forever Searching, Lost in the Smoky Mountains. The book is the most comprehensive piece of material I have ever seen regarding the disappearance of Dennis Martin, and also contains key information brought to light through Bouchard's numerous interviews. The content of these interviews clears up many misconceptions that have been perpetuated about this case. For example, Bouchard tracked down the family of FBI agent Jim Reich and spoke with them regarding his untimely death. Bouchard was given details regarding the life challenges Jim Reich faced, but chose not to publish them in his book, only saying that it had nothing to do with the Martin case.
The other conspiracy theory was about, Agent Reich and his suicide in '93, which was all based on some people's suspicion that it was due to how the way he did, that the case of Dennis Martin's case wasn't handled the right way. So, and that had nothing to do with it. I spoke with family members and his son, and I didn't disclose the reason, what led up to his suicide, but it had nothing to do with any of his any of the Dennis Lloyd Martin case.
The most important interview Bouchard conducted was with Harold Key himself. Contrary to some sources that say Mr. Key passed away in 2010, he was still very much alive in the summer of 2016 when Bouchard spoke with him. At this time, Harold Key was in his 90s, but Bouchard says he was still very sharp and had a good memory of the events of 1969. Mr. Key states that on June 14th, before he and his family walked into the woods towards Rowan's Creek, he noticed an empty white car parked along the side of the road. Initially, he thought nothing of it. After walking into the forest a few hundred yards, he saw a middle-aged man moving quickly through the woods towards the road. The man was alone and not carrying anything over his shoulder. Mr. Key described the man as dirty, disheveled, sweating profusely, and very anxious. When the man saw the Key family, he began to walk faster. He eventually made it to the road, entered the white vehicle, and drove off at a high rate of speed, heading towards Cades Cove. Afterwards, the Key family continued walking into the woods in search of wildlife. As Mr. Key came to Rowan's Creek, he said he heard a child scream the word "help," and then heard an additional agonizing scream of pain. He could tell that the scream came from a great distance away, so he continued walking along Rowan's Creek, but never saw the child or anything out of place.
Harold noticed a white male, he said was in his 30s or 40s, not dressed in any type of animal clothing or anything like that, but when he used the term disheveled, when I interviewed him, he said disheveled. I said, what did you mean by disheveled? He said, well, his clothes were like they had gone through brush, and he was sweating profusely. And he said, I turned to my wife, and the only thing I could say to her was, this man isn't thinking right.
Wow.
So they see him get into a white car, and he says the white car, I didn't pay attention to the make or model, but it was up on the road when we pulled in, and it took off at a high rate of speed, and it threw gravel and everything into the woods. What wasn't told in any of these stories, because this was the first interview that Harold really had after that with anybody, was that Harold said that he specifically heard somebody up in the mountain range scream, help.
Bouchard also interviewed Mr. Key's daughter, Wanda Key Grandstaff, who told him that her father was a World War II veteran, a very tough man, and that had he seen someone carrying a child over their shoulder, as has been perpetuated, he would have gone after the man. Mrs. Grandstaff also stated that the information in newspapers that reported her brothers seeing a bear or man hiding in the bushes were incorrect. Her brothers never saw anyone, but one of them did hear the screams. The reason for this was that Mr. Key was walking far ahead of the rest of the family when the incident occurred, and Mr. Key's sons were focused on playing along the trail. Mr. Key was adamant that he only saw one man in the woods that day, and he walked out of the forest and drove off in the white car. Mr. Key told Bouchard he never used the term moonshiner or wild man to describe the person he saw, contrary to some reports. Harold Key also spoke to Bouchard about the very strange experience of receiving a phone call at home from an unknown individual. This person apparently told him that the missing child was none of his business and to not talk about it. He says the following day, FBI agents Jim Reich and Wallace Estill came to his home to interview him regarding his Rowan's Creek sighting. Wallace Estill was the second FBI agent involved in the Dennis Martin case. Apparently, he was more in charge of dealing with the Martin family, while Jim Reich dealt more with the day-to-day search. I was able to confirm that Wallace Estill was an FBI agent in the Tennessee area at this time. After the FBI agents finished interviewing Mr. Key, they told him not to talk about the incident with anyone. The FBI agents later went on to meet with Mr. Key a second time when they met him at Rowan's Creek. Mr. Key states that while driving en route to Rowan's Creek, he was intercepted by the FBI and then taken there. This is confirmed in the official NPS report. 2 years later, Mr. Key would receive a telephone call from the unknown individual, telling him that the case is closed and to forget what he's heard. Harold Key says that he never again spoke to anyone about the incident until Bouchard interviewed him in 2016, because he feared for the safety of his family. The only reason he agreed to the interview was because almost everyone related to the case, including the FBI agents, were now dead. Mr. Key believed that Dennis Martin was killed and his body was left in the woods. Some may be asking themselves, why did Bill Martin tell David Paulides that Mr. Key saw someone carrying something on their shoulder? It is hard to know for sure. Mr. Martin never mentioned this detail in his letter to the Park Service or in any newspaper interview from 1969. Sometimes parents of lost children push the abduction angle because it's one where their child may still be alive somewhere. And who can blame them? The fact is, Harold Key has never gone on record, in 1969 or in 2016, stating that the man he saw was carrying anything. His story has not changed much in the 50 years that have passed. Underreported newspaper clippings from 1969 reveal that Mr. Key did in fact tell reporters that the man he saw entered a white car. Mr. Key would have no reason to hide particular facts in the late stages of his life.
Why did he talk to you, by the way?
Well, what he told me when I had talked to him, he was, even for 93, he was very sharp, and he was very direct to the point. Southern hospitality, unbelievable. And he said, listen, kid. And at that time I was 50-something years old. He said, let me tell you what, kid, listen. He says, I'm 93 years old. The two FBI agents that investigated it have passed away. He said, most of the people that were involved in the case passed away. What the hell are they going to do to me if I tell you?
Yeah.
I would strongly encourage anyone with an interest in the Dennis Martin disappearance to read Mr. Bouchard's book. The information is concise and well-sourced. Additionally, you can listen to an in-depth interview with Bouchard regarding this case on the Micah Hanks program podcast, which I will link in the description.
If you had to look at all the evidence that you have diligently gone out and sought after and retrieved, what seems to be the most tangible lead in terms of what might get to the bottom of what happened to Dennis Lloyd Martin?
Well, I think the real tangible lead you have now, probably the one and the only one that still exists, based on the information I was provided by each person that I had interviewed, if their information was correct and nobody was making any misleading statements, I probably think that more than likely Harold Key had scared away somebody that may have possibly attempted to abduct Dennis Martin. I believe at that point Dennis Martin wandered off, ended up in the area of the Big Hollow, and had passed away from exposure.
If we put all of this information together, it can point us in a few possible directions. Dwight McCarter believes Dennis Martin is somewhere along West Prong. The footprint possibly matching Dennis was found nearby, and the skeleton allegedly discovered by the ginseng hunter in Big Hollow is close to West Prong. Could Dennis Martin have gotten lost, followed the West Prong before finally succumbing to exposure or some other cause in Big Hollow? Mr. Key's sighting in Rowan's Creek is still incredibly important. I think we can be certain at this point that the man Mr. Key saw was not a Sasquatch or a feral human, unless they drive white cars. However, this man may have been a suspect. Mr. Key did not think to get the license plate, make, or model of the vehicle, so we have little to go on. There is an interesting letter sent to Chief Ranger Lee Snedden in the NPS report. It's from a police chief named Hugh Wells, saying he received an anonymous phone call from a woman stating that she had seen Dennis Martin not long after he disappeared, riding in a white vehicle with a bald middle-aged man driving it. She was positive that the boy was Dennis Martin. I mention this letter only in passing. It could be something, or it could be absolutely nothing. Many anonymous tips flood in when a child goes missing, and most of them turn out to be irrelevant. It is interesting, though, that the NPS put this specific tip in the official report. Mr. Key was not able to pinpoint the exact location of the scream he heard, only that it seemed to come from a great distance. Did the scream come from Dennis Martin? If it did, then was he injured? Is it possible that Mr. Key walked in on an aborted kidnapping? Today we have more accurate details than ever, but many questions still remain. It does seem that the two most likely places Dennis could be found are either in the Rowans Creek area or in the West Prong Big Hollow area. It is truly unfortunate that a more thorough search of Big Hollow was never performed. If searchers had used cadaver dogs, maybe they could have found something. As time continues to pass, any body located in the area is only going to be covered by more and more foliage. It is likely we will never know what truly happened to Dennis Martin, whether he simply became lost, or he was abducted or attacked by a wild animal. However, there still may be a chance that his remains could be found and provide some answers. This could at least give the Martin family, who has had to endure the unimaginable, some amount of closure.